A horror revenge story, Margaret Holloway stood in the abandoned parking lot of the Riverside Mall, her 50-year-old hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel of her Honda Civic. The mall had been closed for 3 years now, its windows boarded up, graffiti sprawling across the once pristine facade. But Margaret wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here because the voices had finally told her where to find them. 25 years. That's how long it had been since they took her daughter. The autumn wind howled through the empty lot, carrying with it the scent of decay and forgotten memories. Margaret checked her rearview mirror, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face carved with lines of grief that no amount of time could erase. In the back seat lay a duffel bag containing items she'd spent months collecting: candles, salt, an old leather book she'd purchased from a dealer in occult antiquities, and photographs. So many photographs of Emily. Her daughter's face smiled up at her from the passenger seat, frozen forever at 17 in a silver frame. Emily had been beautiful, with her mother's green eyes and her father's warm smile. She'd been accepted to Princeton. She'd been in love for the first time. She'd been everything until that October night in 2000 when she went to a party at Jason Murdoch's house and never came home. The police had called it an accident. The autopsy revealed Emily had drowned in the Murdoch's pool after mixing alcohol with prescription medication. Case closed. Tragic teen mistake. Margaret had screamed until her throat bled that her daughter didn't drink, didn't take pills, that something was wrong. But money talks, and the Murdochs had plenty of it. Jason's father was a state senator. The investigation was perfunctory at best. Margaret knew the truth. She'd always known. At Emily's funeral, she'd seen them. Jason and his 3 friends, Derek, Tyler, and Connor. They'd stood in the back, whispering to each other, smirking behind their hands. No remorse, no fear. Just the arrogance of boys who knew they were untouchable. For years, Margaret had tried to move on. She'd gone to therapy, joined support groups, tried to rebuild her shattered life. Her husband couldn't bear the weight of their loss and left her within 2 years. She'd lost her job as a high school counselor because she couldn't focus, couldn't function. She'd been hollowed out, a ghost haunting her own life. But then, a year ago, something changed. Margaret had been cleaning out the attic when she found Emily's diary, hidden behind a loose board. In it, her daughter had written about Jason Murdoch's escalating obsession with her, his refusal to accept her rejection, his threatening texts. The final entry, dated the day before her death, made Margaret's blood run cold. Jason said if I don't go to his party tomorrow night, he'll make me regret it. Mom, I'm scared, but if I tell you, you'll worry. I'll just go, stay for an hour, and leave. What's the worst that could happen? Margaret had collapsed on the attic floor, the diary clutched to her chest, and wept for hours. When she finally stood, something inside her had crystallized into cold, hard purpose. She would have justice for Emily, even if she had to drag it from the depths of hell itself. The research had consumed her. She'd traveled to New Orleans, Salem, and obscure towns where people still remembered the old ways. She'd learned about spirits and summonings, about prices paid and debts collected. And she'd discovered that revenge, real revenge, required sacrifice. Now, at 50 years old, Margaret was ready to pay that price. She stepped out of the car, the October wind cutting through her jacket. The Riverside Mall had been Jason Murdoch's first real estate development after taking over his father's business. He'd cut corners, used substandard materials, bribed inspectors. When the roof collapsed during a winter storm, killing 2 maintenance workers, Jason had somehow escaped prosecution again. The mall was condemned, and Jason walked away richer than before. But tonight, this cursed place would serve a different purpose. Margaret hauled the duffel bag from the back seat and walked toward the mall's north entrance. The chain on the door had already been cut. She'd seen to that during her reconnaissance last week. Inside, her footsteps echoed through the cavernous space. Moonlight filtered through holes in the collapsed roof, casting strange shadows across overturned kiosks and shattered storefronts. She made her way to the center court, where a dried-up fountain stood like a monument to decay. This was the spot. She could feel it, a cold presence that made her breath visible in the air, despite the mild autumn temperature. Margaret set down the bag and began her preparations. She poured a circle of salt around the fountain, 12 feet in diameter, carefully following the instructions from the leather-bound grimoire. At 4 cardinal points, she placed black candles and lit them with shaking hands. The flames burned an unnatural blue-green color. From her bag, she withdrew the photographs, not just of Emily, but of them, Jason, Derek, Tyler, and Connor. She'd tracked them all down over the past year. Jason was now a real estate mogul living in a mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. Derek had become a corporate lawyer in Manhattan. Tyler worked for his family's pharmaceutical company in Boston. Connor had moved to California, working in tech. All of them successful, all of them unpunished. All of them had built their lives on the foundation of her daughter's death. Margaret placed their photographs in the center of the circle, along with personal items she'd stolen. Jason's monogrammed cufflink, Derek's law school ring, Tyler's prescription bottle, Connor's favorite pen. Getting these items had been dangerous, but desperation made people bold. Finally, she withdrew the knife. It was old, the blade forged from iron that had been buried in a graveyard for 20 years. She'd paid a small fortune for it, and the dealer had warned her, "Once you begin this ritual, there's no turning back." The entity you're summoning doesn't distinguish between justice and vengeance. It will take what it's owed. "Good," Margaret had replied. Now standing in the circle, she opened the grimoire to the marked page. The words were in Latin, but she'd practiced them until they felt natural on her tongue. She began to chant, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. The temperature dropped dramatically. The candle flames stretched higher, dancing wildly though there was no wind. Margaret felt the presence before she saw it, a darkness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, coalescing in the center of the circle. A figure began to form. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every way. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its face, if it could be called that, was a void of darkness with 2 points of red light where eyes should be. "Margaret Holloway," it spoke, and its voice was like grinding metal in distant screams. "You have called, and I have answered. What do you offer?" Margaret stood straighter, meeting those terrible red eyes. "I offer myself. My remaining years, my soul, whatever you require. In exchange, I want justice for my daughter Emily. I want those who killed her to face punishment." The entity circled the salt line, studying her. "Justice is a human concept. What you seek is revenge. Are you certain this is the path you choose? Once begun, it cannot be undone." "I'm certain." "Then state their names." Margaret's voice was steady, years of grief hardening into resolve. "Jason Murdoch, Derek Patterson, Tyler Brennan, Connor Walsh. They took my daughter's life and faced no consequences. I want them to know fear. I want them to suffer as she suffered. I want them dead." The entity seemed to smile, though it had no mouth. "Your terms are accepted. But know this, you will witness their ends, and you will feel every moment of their terror as if it were your own. This is the price of summoning me. When the 4th one falls, your debt will be collected." "I understand." The entity reached out a shadowy appendage, and Margaret gasped as icy pain shot through her chest. She felt something being pulled from deep within her, like roots being torn from soil. When it withdrew, she fell to her knees, suddenly exhausted. "It is done," the entity whispered. "The hunt begins tonight." Then it was gone, and Margaret was alone in the mall with only the dying candles for company. The news came 3 days later. Jason Murdoch had been found dead in his home office, apparently having suffered a massive heart attack. But the police were baffled by certain details. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His hands were torn and bloody as if he'd been clawing at something, and every mirror in his house had shattered. Margaret felt it the moment he died. A surge of dark satisfaction mixed with Jason's final moments of horror. She'd seen through his eyes as something impossible crawled from his computer screen, something that wore Emily's face but moved all wrong. She'd felt his terror as he realized what was coming for him, felt his heart explode in his chest from sheer fear. Derek Patterson died a week later. The corporate lawyer had been working late when security footage showed him backing away from something in his office, screaming, before throwing himself through his 15th floor window. The video showed nothing pursuing him, But Margaret knew. She'd felt Derek's mind fracturing as whispers filled his head, each one in Emily's voice, recounting everything he'd done that night, every lie he'd told, every moment he'd held her under the water while Jason and the others watched. Tyler Brennan lasted only 3 more days. He was found in his car at the bottom of a quarry. The vehicle's interior was covered in scratches, as if Tyler had been trying desperately to escape something trapped inside with him. The autopsy revealed he'd drowned, his lungs filled with pool water, though the car had plunged into the quarry dry. Margaret had felt his death too, felt the phantom water filling her own lungs, felt his recognition in those final moments that this was exactly how Emily had died. Now, only Connor Walsh remained. Margaret sat in her small apartment, watching the news coverage of the 3 mysterious deaths. Speculation ranged from serial killer to elaborate suicide pact. The media had discovered that all 3 men had been at the same party 25 years ago, where a young woman had died. Reporters were digging into Emily's case again. Questions were being raised. Even in death, her daughter was finally being heard. Margaret felt the entity's presence before she saw it. The television flickered, and there it was, reflected in the dark screen. "One remains," it said. "Connor Walsh has fled to a cabin in the Oregon wilderness, but he cannot hide from what's owed. Tonight the debt will be settled. All debts." Margaret nodded. She felt tired, so tired. The past month had aged her more than the previous 25 years. Every time one of them died, she'd felt it. Their fear, their pain, their final moments of understanding. She'd wanted them to suffer, and they had. But she'd suffered too, just as the entity had promised. "And then?" she asked quietly. "Then you will join me, Margaret Holloway. Your soul is already marked. When Connor Walsh takes his last breath, yours will follow." She'd known this was coming. She'd accepted it long ago. "Will I see Emily again?" The entity was silent for a long moment. "That is not for me to say. I exist in the spaces between, in the shadows of vengeance and retribution. What lies beyond is not my domain." Margaret smiled sadly. "Then I hope there's nothing. I hope there's just peace." That night, as Margaret lay in bed, she felt it begin. Somewhere in Oregon, Connor Walsh was experiencing his final moments. She felt his terror as something came through his cabin door, something impossible. She felt his heart racing, felt him trying to run, felt the moment he recognized that death had come for him at last. And then, just before the end, Margaret felt something else, a warmth, a presence she hadn't felt in 25 years. In her mind's eye, she saw Emily, not as she'd been in those final terrible moments, but as she'd been on her last birthday, laughing and whole and full of life. "Thank you, Mom," Emily whispered. "You can rest now." As Connor Walsh's heart stopped beating in that distant cabin, Margaret Holloway closed her eyes and let go. The apartment was silent. The candles she'd lit earlier burned down to nothing. In the morning, her neighbor would find her, peaceful in death, a slight smile on her face and her daughter's photograph clutched to her chest. The news would call it a strange coincidence. 4 men and 1 woman, all connected to a 25-year-old tragedy, all dead within a month. Investigators would chase theories for years, never finding a satisfactory answer. But in the quiet places, in the shadows between justice and vengeance, something ancient and terrible smiled. The debt had been paid in full, and somewhere in America, a mother's love had proven more powerful than death itself. The end.